to ask former Cambridge City Council member Jivan Sobrinho-Wheeler to have his presentation. Jivan?
Thank you. Yeah, it's great to be here. I'm also going to share my screen here. Does that show up okay? Great. So James mentioned, I'm Jivan Sobrinho-Wheeler. I'm currently the New England Progressive Governance Director for the Working Families Party. So I work in Rhode Island with elected officials on policy and governance, including on housing. But I was previously a city councilor in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and co-chair of the council's housing committee. So I'm going to talk today about a couple different approaches to affordable housing from my time on the council in Cambridge. One is an affordable housing overlay. It's a zoning tool to create more affordable housing that Cambridge has used and that some other cities are looking at. The other is a community land trust, which looks at taking existing housing and existing land off the private market and makes it permanently affordable. And there are community land trusts all over the country. All right. So on this next slide, so this just starts with an overview of what housing looks like in Cambridge right now. Some of the most expensive housing in the country, the median rent for a single bedroom apartment is $2,500 a month. Median condo is $750,000, and to buy a detached single family home is $1.5 million. Nearly half of Cambridge residents who rent are rent burdened, meaning they spend more than 30% of their income on rent every month. We have challenges in Massachusetts, and that a statewide referendum about 25 years ago banned rent control, other kinds of tenant protections. And as Cambridge and other cities around the country have gotten more desirable, we now have a wait list with 20,000 residents for our public housing authority. And so an approach that we looked at and the city ultimately implemented was an affordable housing overlay. Overlays is a change to the city's zoning code that makes it easier to build affordable housing. The fact that it's an overlay means that it's on top of the existing zoning, and it applies to creating affordable housing across the whole city, and only affordable housing in this case, although you can do zoning overlays for different kinds of things as well. The goals of an affordable housing overlay is to give affordable housing an advantage over market rate development by making it possible to make affordable housing that's a little bit taller, that doesn't require as much parking, that doesn't require the same setbacks. So to give affordable housing a leg up, and also to reduce the cost it requires to make affordable housing by making it as of right if it meets certain requirements. So if the affordable housing meets all of the requirements in terms of height, in terms of setbacks, it doesn't require a comprehensive permit, which is another process affordable housing can go through if it doesn't meet the zoning in a certain area. This, like Lisa was talking about, is sort of moving away from a project-based approach towards a process that's predictable and citywide. And then this is sort of a look at affordable housing in Cambridge before the affordable housing overlay was implemented. So if you're familiar with Cambridge at all, Harvard is right here in the center, MIT is over here on the eastern part, and Kendall Square, where a lot of the biotech is. Boston is just on the other side of this river. And the different shades of orange and red here are where the affordable housing is. And so you can see there's a lot on this eastern half side of the city that is denser. There's some up here in the northern part. There's a large development that's been here since the 50s, but then very little in this section here. And this is the part of the city that is single family only, maybe has a few duplexes. It's whiter than the rest of the city. Housing is more expensive. Most of Cambridge is not zoned single family only, but this is the part where you see it, and at the same time see less affordable housing there compared to other parts of the city as well. And then down here sort of have some of the challenges to building affordable housing. It's the high land costs. Cambridge is a desirable place. Just getting the land can be a real challenge, and competition for market rate developers for biotech spaces, other commercial spaces from the universities here for market rate housing. It's challenging if you're an affordable housing developer who's relying on subsidies, tax credits, limited funding from our affordable housing trust to compete with that. And then the other part that is really challenging about creating affordable housing is the approval process. To going through to get the permits, it can be challenged by abutters and neighbors. That unpredictability for how long it's going to take to get affordable housing, whether the initial proposal that you put forward is what you're going to end up with, or you're going to have to shrink it or change pieces of it as part of that process, ends up driving up the cost to create affordable housing. And so the overlay was a way to address all those different pieces at one time. And then here's just a map looking at redlining compared to that map of where affordable housing is, and the parts of the city that weren't redlined, that were graded good and favorable, are the parts where it was harder for Black families to buy into at the time of redlining, are also the parts today that still have the least affordable housing. And so you see these trends really continue to the present day, which was another goal of the affordable housing overlay. So this sort of looks like, shows what the affordable housing overlay does in practice. And there's a few different colors here. The largest one is this sort of light yellow, which are the areas that are more residential neighborhoods. This orange are sort of the commercial corridors. Orange and green, I should say, are the commercial corridors, and then purple are the sort of office areas that were at one time more industrial and now more office buildings. And each of those translates to a different possibility under the affordable housing overlay. So in the neighborhoods that are more residential, where you mostly just find single family homes, you find some triple deckers, some apartment buildings, you can build up to 4 stories of affordable housing, so slightly taller than what's possible under the existing zoning, but not totally out of scale either. On the corridors, though, you can go up to 6 stories. So where there already is commercial development, there's already these corridors where there's where it's a bit denser, you can go even higher for affordable housing. And then in the office areas, up to 7 stories. And so on these slides, it's just an example of what that looks like. So in a residential setting, you can make a building that's affordable housing as of right up to 4 stories. It may be a little taller than what's in the neighborhood. There are some buildings that are already this size because zoning used to permit it, but then through down zoning in the past several decades is no longer. So affordable housing may be a little bit taller, may also be around the same size as some buildings that were there before the current zoning was implemented. And then on corridors and some of the other areas, you can go up to 7 stories. And so you can have up to 100 or so unit buildings, but gives a sense of while adding predictability, while moving away from sort of a project-based approach for affordable housing, still an attempt to fit with the sort of existing form there and have different types of building that's allowed in different contexts. The piece that came up, and there was plenty of pushback on this, plenty of debate around it, often was around that form and of folks being concerned about how tall the building was going to be in their backyard. Cambridge is a pretty progressive place. There was, everybody would say they were for affordable housing, would not, you don't see the opposition you see in maybe other parts of the country where people are afraid of public housing or afraid of the folks living in affordable housing. The concerns are often framed around the type of building, the shadows, the traffic, the lack of parking. And one of the pieces that would come up were sort of misconstruing and zones of the city like this, where you can build up to 7 stories, confusion about, in my residential neighborhood, that's mostly single family homes or triple deckers, is there going to be a 7-story building there? And there was not, but it was hard to sometimes convince folks of that. And this slide, sort of talking about that debate a little more. So the affordable housing overlay was initially introduced before I was on the city council even. It was a multi-year process. And in the session before, it didn't have the votes. It was tabled. Council wasn't able to pass it. It became then an election issue. It was something all the candidates who were running, including myself, were asked about. Groups both for and against it organized forums about it, endorsed slates of candidates. It was a case where an issue, to really get community buy-in, to really be able to pass at that political level, required organizing, required an electoral process. It was one vote shy. Housing was a big part of my campaign. It was a big part of other folks' campaigns as well. I'm a renter, like 2/3 of Cambridge are, but we had hardly any renters on the city council. And so with my election, we had the votes to pass it. It became law the following year. And it's now been in place about 2 years. And so just looking at some of the effects, it's helped produce about a couple hundred new affordable homes, both for folks taking advantage of the zoning piece that where it wouldn't have been possible to build affordable housing before, also through the expanded permitting process, where before it could be delayed, could be challenged through a lawsuit. Now, because it's as of right, the affordable housing is able to get through that process quicker and break ground earlier. And then on the right here, we have an example of one of the affordable housing projects that's going to be built under the affordable housing overlay. And then there's one more slide on the overlay here. And this was a piece just showing other cities looking at affordable housing overlays, some that have been explicitly modeled on Cambridge's. Boston across the river is exploring it. Somerville, which is our neighbor to the north, passed an affordable housing overlay. They tapered it for their local context and built it around their existing zoning, but found the overlay approach really helpful. And then on the other side of the country, Berkeley, California is also looking at this there. And I've been able to talk with the city councilor, Terry Taplin, who's working on it there. It's great to see cross-pollination around this. And then briefly, I was just going to talk about one other approach towards affordable housing while I was on the council. Here we go. And it's a community land trust. So the affordable housing overlay was mostly geared at building new affordable housing, at creating new affordable housing from community development to corporations, public housing, other types of affordable housing developers. A community land trust is looking at taking existing housing, taking existing land off the private market and making it permanently affordable. And so sort of the reasons for a community land trust really focused on another tool in Cambridge's toolbox. There are lots of different ways to go about creating affordable housing. No one of them is really going to solve the crisis of Cambridge or other communities. There were folks who were interested in the community land trust approach who weren't thrilled about the affordable housing overlay, who weren't thrilled about building new affordable housing in their communities, but were interested in the community land trust approach. And I tried to be really explicit of the fact we definitely need more housing. We need to be building more. We also need to be looking at how do we take housing off the market and making it permanently affordable as well. And so one of the interesting things about a community land trust is that it can work in affordable housing contexts that are sometimes more challenging for other affordable housing developers. Looking at smaller buildings like triple dexers and duplexes and converting them to affordable housing, looking at smaller lots, also doing affordable home ownership, which is a piece that sometimes other affordable housing developers are more focused at rental units, and so having that opportunity as well. And then a community land trust is also interesting in a place like Cambridge, where there are a lot of older homeowners who bought their housing when it was much more affordable in the 60s, 70s, who now own a duplex, a triple decker, would like to see it become affordable long-term, a way to see about working with folks on affordability there. And so this just gives an idea of how a community land trust works. A nonprofit has a deed restriction on the land to keep it permanently affordable. They can buy or develop affordable housing or affordable community or retail spaces on top of that land. Folks can buy a house and own their own individual house, but because the land under it remains with the community land trust, you can have a restriction that it remain permanently affordable. This is just sort of another illustration of that. because the CLT owns the ground, there's that deed restriction, but the housing costs, when you separate that from the land, you're able to take out the housing costs. So even in markets where housing prices are really skyrocketing, if a lot of that cost is the land in a community land trust space, the house doesn't have to double, triple in price, as we've seen in places like Cambridge over 10, 20 years. It can appreciate if you're a homeowner in it, you can build equity, but when it's time to pass on to the next generation, when it's time to sell, it has to remain at a price that's affordable for someone else to buy into it. And so, in starting to create a community land trust, we looked at different sites in the city, sites that were owned by the city, a few vacant lots, some parking lots, some spaces that were owned by the universities, cataloging them. The city had purchased land recently, looking at a couple sites that were potential development sites there. And then also working with homeowners on deed restrictions for their properties, and advocating at the state level as well. Massachusetts right now doesn't have a tenant opportunity to purchase, which is something that Washington, D.C., other states are looking at, but there's been legislation that would enact it, and that would allow tenants in their buildings to have the first opportunity to buy their units, or if they can't afford to donate that right to a nonprofit or a community land trust. And so that's another potential site to gain affordable housing as well. And so with the community land trust approach and the affordable housing overlay approach, just hoping to go over two different ways we looked at to create affordable housing, two different methods and two different ways of working with the community as well. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn it back.
Thank you very much, Jivan, for that presentation.